Welcome back to Big Riff Energy. Today I am talking about the 10 greatest metal albums ever made. And spoiler alert, none of the records behind me are on the list. I just wanted to illustrate how difficult it was to get this down to 10. I've had some requests for top 10 lists by subgenre, and I'll get to those, but I thought it would make sense just to start with metal regardless of subgenre. Of course, there's some opinion involved here, but I'm trying to strike a balance between my personal taste, historical context, and significance to the genre. So let's dive right in. Number 1, Black Sabbath, Master of Reality from 1971. I would have considered any of the first 6 Black Sabbath records for this list, maybe even the first 2 Dio albums that they did. My personal favorites are Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, Mob Rules, and even later Headless Cross, which is a phenomenal record. But again, I'm trying to strike a balance between personal preference and things like significance to the genre and historical context. So the first Black Sabbath record, obviously monumental, created metal, and really inadvertently created quite a few subgenres of metal that became prominent in the following decades. Paranoid, the next record, obviously monumental in other ways, bringing this style of music to the general population. It was a hit record because of the title track, and suddenly this new burgeoning genre of hard rock turning into heavy metal is now on the zeitgeist of the whole world. However, those records, these fellas only had a couple few days. They recorded the first record in a day. It's really almost a live album without a crowd. Paranoid, kind of similar, very few overdubs, very little time spent on the recording process. They were really just kind of documenting where they were at in the live arena on those first 2 records. Not really getting into production tricks and that sort of thing. There's some fun little goodies on Paranoid, obviously the Iron Man voice and all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't until Master of Reality where they had a lot of time to actually work on things in the studio, work out songs, do new stuff such as tuning the guitar and bass down to C# standard. And if we're going to consider historical context, there's some pretty heavy stuff on those first 2 records, but try to imagine being in 1971 and metal doesn't exist, and then you hear the riff from Into the Void in C# standard, or you hear the breakdown from Children of the Grave in C# standard. Monumental, world-altering stuff, and really their first full-blown studio record where they were learning about production techniques and that sort of thing. Number 1, put it on the shelf, Black Sabbath, Master of Reality. Number 2, Judas Priest, Stained Class from 1978. Again, you can almost just take your pick of most Judas Priest records from back in the day. Sad Wings of Destiny was a monumental push forward for the metal genre. Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders of the Faith is a personal favorite period of the band. Obviously, Painkiller took things to a whole other level, but I'm going to pick Stained Class. I think start to finish, this is the band's most consistent record. This came out in 78, so they were the next wave after Black Sabbath, and although Black Sabbath sort of inadvertently invented metal and never really owned that moniker, Judas Priest was the first band to embrace metal wholeheartedly and self-identify as a metal band. And old school metal doesn't get much better than this. This inspired a whole other wave of metal bands like Merciful Fate and Venom and Slayer and all that sort of stuff. Number 2, put it on the shelf, Judas Priest, Stained Class. Number 3, from 1985, you have a record called The Skull by a band called Trouble. This band is a perfect example of embracing all of the traditions that have occurred before the band existed. The down-tuned, scary, spooky, super heavy riffs of Black Sabbath, the dual guitar harmonies and more aggressive attack of Judas Priest, the energy of the new wave of British heavy metal, which morphed into proto-thrash and eventually thrash metal, the soaring operatic vocals of guys like Rob Halford and even Freddie Mercury and King Diamond. Taking all those elements, creating something new and unique out of it, preserving the tradition of metal while bringing it into the present and into the future. And although Trouble is probably more appreciated now than they've ever been, and they toured big arenas and stadiums with Pantera in the 90s, I still feel like they haven't gotten their proper due, although things seem to be headed in that direction. Number 3, put it on the shelf, Trouble, The Skull. Number 4, you've probably heard of this one. Metallica, Master of Puppets, 1986. I don't feel like I need to say anything about this album, really. I will say I tend to prefer Ride the Lightning personally. There's even aspects of Justice that I would say I prefer. I do feel like Master of Puppets has glaring weaknesses, I would say, compared to those two albums. I think Disposable Heroes is too repetitive and goes a little too long. There, I said it. I think the lyrics to Damage Incorporated are fucking stupid. There, I said it. However, I don't think any achievement in the metal genre has higher highs than you'll find on Master of Puppets. They took a genre and completely manipulated it, reinvigorated it, and took it to a place that no one could have ever suspected. And you know a record's good when any record that comes out for the next 40 years that's a crowning achievement of the genre gets compared to Master of Puppets. So it has to be on this list. Maybe the mid-2000s Guitar World magazine propaganda finally worked on me, but I'm gonna give Master of Puppets the edge over Ride the Lightning here. Number 4, put it on the shelf. Metallica, Master of Puppets. Number 5, probably heard of this one too. Slayer, Rain and Blood, also from 1986. So if Metallica took metal to new heights as far as complexity, dynamics, intellectual capacity, that sort of thing, with Master of Puppets, Slayer took the genre to new extremes as far as brutality, speed, aggression, atonal mayhem with Rain and Blood. This, to me, is the benchmark of all extreme metal. It can all be traced back to this. Yes, I'm aware of Bathory. Yes, I'm aware of Merciful Fate and Celtic Frost. I know especially Celtic Frost, they were doing really aggressive, grimy, atonal stuff, but nothing prior to Rain and Blood compares to the unhinged, hyper-violent playing, lyricism, delivery, attitude, aggression, everything. There had never been anything like this before it was made. In that sense, it's similar to Master of Puppets, but obviously Metallica and Slayer were branching off in two different directions with two of the most foundational, influential records the genre has ever seen that came out in the same year. I'm jealous. Number 5, put it on the shelf. Slayer, Rain and Blood. Number 6, Iron Maiden, Somewhere in Time. We are going back to 1986 again. I think we all have to agree that's probably the best year for metal ever. For Iron Maiden, you could really pick any record from Killers through Seventh Son. My favorite has changed quite a bit. For a long time, it was Power Slave. But I just think that in 1986, when they were making this record, they were peaking. They were peaking as far as songwriting, arranging, production, attitude and energy. Their alliance with producer Martin Birch is just like firing on all cylinders. And it produced one of the greatest metal records of all time. That again was very influential for a lot of the more progressive type of metal bands that would follow all the way up until today. There's not a weak song on this album. I would say it's definitely their most consistent record start to finish. And if we can ignore the lyrical subject matter of Long Distance Running, it's pretty much a bulletproof album. The guitar solos are outrageous. These guys are running off of all the years of experience in the studio and on the stage and on tour that they've had up to this point. And it's just one of those situations where the band is peaking on every possible level. And they've got Martin Birch right there with him with all his direct experience making records with this specific band, and it produced Iron Maiden's best record. Number 6, put it on the shelf. Iron Maiden, Somewhere in Time. Number 7, from Tampa, Florida, you've got Morbid Angel with Altars of Madness from 1989. There are death metal records that I choose to listen to before this one. Malevolent Creation, Retribution is a favorite. Death, Spiritual Healing is a favorite. Carcass, Heartwork. However, this is the death metal record by which all other death metal records are judged. Yes, I'm aware of Possessed Seven Churches, Death, Scream, Bloody Gore. I feel like those records were feeling out in the darkness towards this new style of music, which was fully actualized when Altars of Madness came out. And there have been entire micro genres of death metal invented based on 30-second passages of this record. It has every aspect of death metal. It's got the speed and ferocity of thrash, which morphed into death metal. It has the more reverbed out, cavernous, really down-tuned, brutal, spooky death metal. It has all of the lyrical subject matters, which have spread out across multiple subgenres, you know, Lovecraftian monsters, Satan, obviously, a little bit of sci-fi, ghouls, goblins, all that sort of stuff, murder. This is the death metal record. To me, it fully solidified what the genre is, musically and thematically, and the whole attitude. Aesthetically, everything. You've got the Dan Seagrave artwork. I think it's the most important death metal album ever made, and one of the most important metal records ever made. Number 7, put it on the shelf. Morbid Angel, Altars of Madness. Number 8, Pantera, Far Beyond Driven from 1994. You could argue that metal was peaking artistically and creatively in 1986. That being said, no one accomplished what Pantera accomplished with this record. Well, maybe Skid Row did with Slave to the Grind. I'm talking about debuting at number 1 on the Billboard charts, not the rock charts. There were no metal charts. There still aren't. Hard music, I don't think that was a thing. I'm talking about they made Far Beyond Driven, a record which you could say at the time was the most extreme and brutal piece of metal music ever made, and it debuted at number 1 on the actual Billboard charts when it actually meant something. I did mention Skid Row, Slave to the Grind. Great record. That record debuted at number 1, but it's really more of a hard rock and almost like blues rock inspired, bordering on metal album. That record, although it's great, doesn't have anything as extreme or brutal as Slaughtered or Shedding Skin or Becoming. And it's a phenomenon that probably will never be replicated again. There's Pantera records that I would probably listen to before this one, although it was my favorite for a long time. And I gotta acknowledge the band's peaking, and the results were very obvious and tangible when this thing debuted at number 1. Number 8, put it on the shelf. Pantera, Far Beyond Driven. Number 9, Dissection, Storm of the Light's Bane from 1995. Okay, despite being the brainchild of an edgelord delusional dork who lived in a fantasy land and would have gotten destroyed had his feud with Mustaine turned physical, this is a great record. I talked about it earlier with Trouble, this idea of embracing the traditions of the metal genre and incorporating all of these beautiful, awesome, powerful, evil, heavy aspects of the genre, creating something new and then carrying the genre to places where it's never been before. This record does that for sure. It has the melodic sensibilities of bands like Maiden, Priest, early Metallica, Trouble, but it has the darkness and heaviness of bands like Black Sabbath, Slayer, evil, cold vibe of the first wave of black metal from their native Scandinavia. And it takes all of those things, pumps them into this songwriting machine. And I'm talking about songs. I'm not talking about big, long, boring things with a collection of riffs. It is possible to write songs in extreme metal. And Storm of the Light's Bane is a perfect example of how to do it. And it's on the list, even though that guy sucked. Number 9, put it on the shelf. Dissection, Storm of the Light's Bane. The 10th and final entry on this list, Mastodon, Remission from 2003. This was a major game changer. I was 15 years old when this came out, and I remember seeing the music video for March of the Fire Ants on Headbangers Ball when that was still a thing. Almost all modern metal, let me rephrase that, all modern metal that's any good owes a debt of gratitude to this record. This is still my favorite Mastodon record. There were some really magical things going on in the Mid-South in the 2000s. I was a part of it. It had a huge impact on who I am, and it had a huge impact on heavy music in general. There were a lot of standout records that came out of that scene. Wake, Voices of Omens, Baroness, Red Album, Kylesa, Static Tensions. I could go on and on and on. But this is the band and this is the record that brought that scene into the mainstream. They signed a major label deal off of this record, and all of a sudden, everyone knows about progressive, down-tuned, sludgy, brutal Southern metal. And the world is a better place because of it. Number 10, put it on the shelf. Mastodon, Remission. And there you have it. These are the greatest metal albums ever made. Comment below, tell me some of your favorite metal albums and what you think I left off, because I know I left off a bunch. Like, subscribe to this channel for similar content. Check out the new Spirit Adrift record, Ghost at the Gallows, if you haven't. And I'll see you guys for the next episode of the podcast or another top 10 list, whichever comes first. Cheers.